My boss looked me in the eye and said, "Face it, Rachel, you're just a secretary who'll never amount to anything." He had no idea I'd been working nights to buy his company. My name is Rachel Martinez, and this is the story of how I went from being humiliated in front of my entire office to becoming the boss of the man who destroyed my confidence for 3 years. But before I tell you how I bought the company that employed me, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love stories about workplace justice and career comebacks, make sure to hit that subscribe button because you're going to want to hear every single detail of this revenge. 3 years ago, I was 29 years old and working as an executive assistant at Meridian Financial Group, a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Chicago. On paper, it was a good job. The pay was decent, the benefits were solid, and I had my own desk in a glass office building that made me feel important when I walked through the lobby each morning. But the reality was very different. My boss, Gerald Hutchinson, was a 45-year-old vice president who had made it his personal mission to remind me exactly where I stood in the company hierarchy every single day. Gerald wasn't just my supervisor, he was a bully. The kind of man who would smile at clients and senior management, then turn around and treat his staff like they were barely human. He had this way of making you feel small with just a look, like you were wasting his valuable time by simply existing in his presence. "Rachel, get me coffee. Make sure it's hot this time." "Rachel, these files are a mess. A trained monkey could organize better than this." "Rachel, when you're done playing dress up, maybe you could actually do some work." Every day, it was something. Every day, he found a new way to chip away at my confidence, to remind me that I was just a secretary, and that secretaries didn't matter in the world of high finance. I'll be honest with you, it was breaking me down. I'd go home every night questioning my worth, wondering if maybe Gerald was right. Maybe I wasn't smart enough for anything more. Maybe I really was just a secretary who would never amount to anything. But Gerald made one crucial mistake. He assumed that because I filed his papers and answered his phone calls, I didn't have ambitions of my own. He assumed that because I said yes, sir, and of course, Mr. Hutchinson, I didn't have a plan. He was wrong about that, dead wrong. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March. It was the quarterly all-hands meeting where the entire office, about 60 employees, gathered in the main conference room to hear updates from senior management. I was there taking notes, as always, sitting in the back with the other administrative staff. Gerald was presenting the Q1 results to the room, looking confident in his expensive suit, commanding attention like he always did. Everything was going normally until someone from the accounting department asked about the company's investment strategies. It was a complex question about portfolio diversification and risk management, topics I'd actually studied extensively during my night classes. Without thinking, I raised my hand. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was 3 years of pent-up frustration. Maybe it was the confidence I'd been building through my MBA coursework. But I had an insight about the question, a suggestion that could actually improve our client returns by about 15%. Gerald saw my raised hand, and his expression immediately darkened. "Rachel, this isn't the time for administrative questions. We're discussing business strategy." "Actually, Mr. Hutchinson, I have a suggestion about the portfolio allocation strategy that might—" He cut me off mid-sentence, in front of 60 people, in front of the entire company. "Rachel, I'm going to stop you right there. This is a meeting for professionals discussing complex financial strategies, not a Q&A session for secretaries. You're here to take notes, not to give business advice you couldn't possibly understand." The room went completely silent. 60 pairs of eyes staring at me. Some looked embarrassed for me. Others looked uncomfortable. A few were trying not to laugh. I felt my face burn with humiliation. My hands started shaking. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and never come back. But Gerald wasn't done. "Look, Rachel, I appreciate that you want to contribute, but let's be realistic here. You're a secretary. You answer phones and file papers. Leave the thinking to people who actually understand finance. Face it, you're just a secretary who'll never amount to anything in this company. That's when something inside me broke. Not broke down, broke open, like a dam bursting. I stood up slowly, closed my notebook, and looked Gerald directly in the eye. The entire room was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. "You're right, Mr. Hutchinson, I am just a secretary, but you know what? That's going to change." And then I walked out of that conference room with every ounce of dignity I could muster. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my laptop screen until 3 a.m., not crying, planning, because what Gerald didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been preparing for this moment for 3 years. Let me back up and tell you what had really been happening during my time at Meridian Financial. 6 months after I started working for Gerald, I realized that this job was either going to destroy me or teach me everything I needed to know about finance. I chose the latter. Every night after work, while Gerald thought I was going home to watch TV like a typical secretary, I was actually driving across town to Northwestern University's evening MBA program. I'd been taking classes for 2.5 years, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working full-time and dealing with Gerald's abuse. I studied corporate finance, investment strategies, mergers and acquisitions, and business law. I learned about hostile takeovers, leveraged buyouts, and shareholder rights. I wrote my thesis on small-scale corporate acquisitions in the financial services sector. And here's the kicker. I used Meridian Financial as my case study. For my thesis research, I had legitimate access to every aspect of the company's operations: financial records, client portfolios, organizational structure, shareholder information, everything. I knew Meridian's strengths, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities better than most of the senior management. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. I needed capital. Remember how Gerald always made me work late? How he'd pile extra assignments on my desk just to watch me struggle? Well, every hour of overtime he forced me to work was an hour I could bill at time and a half. Every weekend he ruined was extra money in my account. But that still wasn't enough for what I had planned. So I started a side business. Nothing glamorous, just freelance financial consulting for small businesses. I'd work my day job for Gerald, go to classes 3 nights a week, and spend weekends helping local entrepreneurs with their books and business plans. I was pulling 18-hour days, 7 days a week. I was exhausted, running on caffeine and pure determination. But I was building something Gerald could never take away from me. After 2 years of this schedule, I had saved nearly $80,000. My MBA was almost complete, and I'd identified exactly how much it would cost to acquire a controlling interest in Meridian Financial Group. Here's what I discovered during my research. Meridian was privately held, but they'd issued shares to employees and some outside investors over the years. The company had about 20,000 shares outstanding, and you needed 10,001 shares to have majority control. Gerald owned 2,500 shares, a nice chunk, but nowhere near controlling interest. The founder, Robert Meridian, had retired 2 years earlier and sold most of his shares to a private equity firm that didn't really pay attention to day-to-day operations. Through my research, I found out that several longtime employees were approaching retirement and looking to cash out their shares. The private equity firm was also open to selling portions of their stake to reduce their exposure. I could buy my way to majority ownership, but it would take everything I had saved, plus a significant loan. The night Gerald humiliated me in that conference room, I made the call. I contacted a business attorney I'd met through my MBA program, and we started making offers. It took 6 weeks of negotiations, financial documentation, and sleepless nights. I had to provide detailed business plans, financial projections, and prove I could manage the debt service. I borrowed against everything: my car, my savings, even my parents' house as a co-signer. But by the first week of May, I owned 10,847 shares of Meridian Financial Group. I was the majority shareholder of the company that employed me. Gerald had no idea. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. I could have walked into Gerald's office the next day and fired him on the spot, but that would have been too easy, too quick. Gerald had spent 3 years systematically destroying my confidence and treating me like I was worthless. I wanted him to understand exactly what it felt like. So I kept working as his secretary. I kept saying, "Yes, sir," and, of course, Mr. Hutchinson. I kept bringing him coffee and filing his papers. But now I was doing it as the owner of the company, watching every move he made. And let me tell you, being the secret owner of your own workplace gives you a very different perspective on things. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. How Gerald would take credit for other people's ideas in management meetings. How he'd throw his subordinates under the bus when projects went wrong. How he'd expense personal dinners as client entertainment. I watched him berate a junior analyst for a mistake that was actually Gerald's fault. I saw him steal a presentation that one of the financial advisors had worked on for weeks. I witnessed him lie to clients about investment performance to cover his own poor decision-making. Gerald wasn't just a bully, he was incompetent. And his incompetence was costing the company money, losing clients, and destroying the careers of good people who deserved better. As the owner, I had a responsibility to fix that. I spent 3 weeks documenting everything. Every inappropriate comment, every ethical violation, every instance of misconduct. I built a case that would justify his termination to anyone who might question my decision. But I also wanted to make sure the transition would be smooth. I couldn't just fire Gerald without having a replacement ready. So I started identifying internal candidates who could step up, people Gerald had overlooked or held back. There was Jennifer in the investment division, brilliant strategist who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times because Gerald felt threatened by her intelligence. There was Marcus in client relations. He had better relationships with our biggest accounts than Gerald ever would, but Gerald kept him in a junior role to maintain his own importance. I started having casual conversations with these people, learning about their goals, their frustrations, their ideas for improving the company. Not as their secret owner, but as a fellow employee who was tired of watching talent get wasted. What I discovered was that Gerald's toxicity had created a powder keg of resentment throughout the company. People were frustrated, demoralized, looking for new jobs. We were losing good people because one man's ego was more important than the company's success. That's when I knew exactly how to handle this situation. I scheduled a board meeting for the following Monday. As the majority shareholder, I had the right to call these meetings whenever I wanted. The agenda was simple: leadership review and strategic planning. Gerald would be there, of course, along with the other senior managers and the representatives from the private equity firm who still held minority shares. He thought he was going to another routine quarterly review. What he was actually walking into was a reckoning 3 years in the making. Monday morning arrived gray and rainy, which felt perfect for what I had planned. I got to the office early, just like always, and prepared the conference room for the 10 a.m. board meeting. Gerald arrived at his usual time, 8:30 sharp, with his usual air of self-importance. He barely glanced at me as I handed him his coffee. Black, 2 sugars, exactly how he liked it. "Rachel, make sure you take detailed notes during the board meeting today," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "And try to keep up this time. I know financial discussions can be challenging for someone with your background." Even knowing what I knew, even holding all the power I held, his casual cruelty still stung. But today would be the last time. "Of course, Mr. Hutchinson. I've prepared all the necessary documents for the meeting." And I had. Financial reports, performance reviews, legal documentation, everything needed to make this transition as smooth and legally bulletproof as possible. The morning crawled by. Every minute felt like an hour. I watched Gerald in his office, completely oblivious to what was coming, still treating everyone around him like they were beneath his notice. At 9:45, the board members started arriving. Patricia Hendricks from the private equity firm, Robert Meridian Jr., representing his father's remaining interests, Sarah Chen, the company's legal counsel. They all knew me as Gerald's secretary. They'd seen me bring coffee to these meetings dozens of times. Today, I would be serving in a very different capacity. At 9:58, Gerald straightened his tie, grabbed his presentation folder, and headed toward the conference room. He paused at my desk just long enough to remind me, "Don't forget your notepad, Rachel." Try to spell the big words correctly. I smiled and followed him into the room with my own folder, one that contained documents he'd never seen before. The conference room at Meridian Financial was all dark wood and leather chairs, designed to project authority and success. A long mahogany table dominated the center, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Gerald took his usual seat at the head of the table, across from where Robert Meridian Jr. normally sat. The other board members arranged themselves along the sides. I took my usual place in the corner, notepad ready, looking every inch the dutiful secretary. "Good morning, everyone," Gerald began with his trademark confidence. "I'm excited to share some excellent Q1 results and discuss our strategic initiatives for the rest of the year." He launched into his presentation, clicking through slides about revenue growth and client acquisition. Everything was going exactly as it always did. Gerald commanding the room, other people listening respectfully, me taking notes in the background. About 10 minutes into his presentation, Gerald paused to take a sip of water. That's when I stood up. "Excuse me, Mr. Hutchinson, but I'd like to add something to the agenda." The room went quiet. Gerald's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. "Rachel, this is a board meeting. You're here to take notes, not to participate. Please sit down." I remained standing and opened my folder. "Actually, Mr. Hutchinson, as the majority shareholder of Meridian Financial Group, I have the right to direct this meeting's agenda." You could have heard a pin drop. Gerald's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, then something approaching panic. "What are you talking about? Rachel, sit down right now or you're fired." Patricia Hendricks from the private equity firm leaned forward. "I'm sorry, did you say majority shareholder?" I pulled out the documentation and placed it on the table. 6 weeks ago, I acquired 10,847 shares of Meridian Financial Group stock, giving me 54.2% ownership of this company. Sarah Chen, the legal counsel, reached for the papers with trembling hands. She reviewed them quickly, her expression growing more serious with each page. "These documents appear to be legitimate," she said quietly. "The stock transfers have been properly recorded. Ms. Martinez is indeed the majority shareholder." The room erupted. Gerald started shouting about how this was impossible, how I was just a secretary, how there had to be some mistake. Patricia was frantically making phone calls to confirm the stock transfers. Robert Jr. was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. But I remained calm. I'd been preparing for this moment for 3 years. "If I could have everyone's attention," I said, my voice steady and professional, "I'd like to discuss the real reason I called this meeting." Slowly, the chaos settled. Gerald was still sputtering objections, but Patricia had confirmed with her firm that the stock transfers were legitimate. There was no denying it. The secretary had just become their boss. "Now," I continued, "I want to address some serious concerns about the leadership and direction of this company." I opened my second folder and began laying out 3 years of documented evidence. Performance metrics showing declining client satisfaction under Gerald's management, records of his expense account abuse, testimonials from employees about his toxic behavior. "Mr. Hutchinson," I said, looking directly at him, "over the past 3 years, your management style has created a hostile work environment that has cost this company talented employees and loyal clients." I presented the documentation systematically. Screenshots of emails where Gerald took credit for subordinates' work, client complaints that had been buried rather than addressed, financial reports showing how his poor decisions had cost the company nearly $200,000 in the past year alone. Gerald tried to interrupt several times, but I continued speaking with the authority I now legally possessed. Furthermore, I said, I have personally witnessed and documented numerous instances of workplace harassment, including public humiliation of employees, discriminatory comments, and abuse of power. I pulled out a transcript of the quarterly meeting where Gerald had humiliated me. I'd had several employees provide written statements about what they'd witnessed. 3 days ago, Mr. Hutchinson told me in front of 60 employees that I was just a secretary who'll never amount to anything. He was wrong about my potential, but more importantly, his behavior represents a pattern of toxic leadership that has no place in a professional organization. I then presented my analysis of the company's potential under different leadership: projected revenue increases, employee retention strategies, client service improvements, all the insights I'd gained through my MBA studies, and my 3 years of observing the company from the inside. Which brings me to my proposal for immediate organizational changes. I looked around the room at each board member, then fixed my gaze on Gerald. Effective immediately, I am terminating Gerald Hutchinson's employment with Meridian Financial Group. Gerald's face went white, then red, then white again. "You can't do this," he shouted, jumping to his feet. "I have a contract. I have rights. You're just a, I'm just a secretary who'll never amount to anything." I finished for him. I believe those were your exact words. Sarah Chen cleared her throat. Actually, as majority shareholder, Ms. Martinez does have the authority to make executive personnel decisions. The employment contracts include standard termination clauses that protect the company's interests. I stood and walked to where Gerald was still standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair. "Gerald, for 3 years you made me feel worthless. You convinced me that I didn't matter, that my opinions didn't count, that I would never be anything more than your coffee-fetching, note-taking secretary. But here's what you never understood. While you were focused on keeping me down, I was building myself up. While you were abusing your power, I was earning the right to take it away from you." I handed him a prepared termination letter. "You have 30 minutes to clear out your office. Security will escort you from the building. Your final paycheck, minus the money you inappropriately charged to your expense account, will be mailed to your home address." Gerald looked around the room desperately, seeking some kind of support or intervention. But Patricia was reviewing financial documents. Robert Jr. was studying my business plan. Sarah was taking notes on the legal proceedings. No one was coming to his rescue. "This isn't over," Gerald muttered as he headed toward the door. "I'll sue this company into the ground. I'll destroy you." I smiled calmly. "Mr. Hutchinson, I own this company, and I have 3 years of documented evidence of your misconduct. I suggest you focus on finding new employment rather than making threats you can't possibly follow through on." And then he was gone. The man who had terrorized me for 3 years, who had made me question my worth and my potential, walked out of my life forever. The conference room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Patricia spoke up. "Ms. Martinez, this is unexpected, but I have to say, your business analysis is impressive. What's your plan for replacing Mr. Hutchinson?" And that's when I smiled for the first time in 3 years, without having to hide it. "Actually," I said, settling into Gerald's former chair at the head of the table, "I have a comprehensive transition plan." Over the next hour, I outlined my strategy for restructuring the company. Jennifer from the investment division would become the new VP of Client Services. She'd already proven her expertise and had the respect of the team. Marcus would head up business development, finally getting the recognition his relationship skills deserved. What amazed the board members was how detailed my plans were. I hadn't just bought the company on impulse. I'd spent months preparing for this transition. "How long have you been planning this?" Robert Jr. asked. "The business acquisition?" "About 6 months. But the personal transformation?" 3 years, one day at a time, every single time Gerald reminded me that I was just a secretary. I explained my night school MBA, my side consulting business, the research I'd done using the company as my thesis case study. Everything had led to this moment. Within the first week, the atmosphere at Meridian Financial completely transformed. Without Gerald's toxic presence, people started speaking up in meetings, sharing ideas, collaborating instead of competing. The junior analyst Gerald used to berate? She presented a market analysis strategy that increased one client's portfolio returns by 12% in the first month. The financial advisor whose presentation Gerald had stolen? He brought in two new high-value clients within 3 weeks. As for me, transitioning from secretary to CEO was surreal. The first time I walked into my new office, Gerald's former office, I just stood there for 10 minutes, taking it all in. The mahogany desk where he used to sit while insulting me was now mine. The window with the city view that I'd only seen from the corner where I used to take notes was now my daily perspective. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Some employees were skeptical about taking orders from their former secretary. A few clients questioned whether I had the experience to manage their investments. But I'd spent 3 years learning every aspect of this business from the ground up. I knew the clients' portfolios better than they did. I understood the market strategies more thoroughly than most of the team. Within 6 months, we'd increased overall client satisfaction by 35%. Revenue was up 22%. Employee turnover dropped to almost zero. People wanted to work for a company that valued their contributions instead of just exploiting their labor. The most satisfying moment came about 4 months after I fired Gerald. We were in the middle of our best quarter in company history when Patricia from the private equity firm called me into a meeting. "Rachel," she said, "I have to admit, when you first revealed your stock purchase, I was concerned. But these results speak for themselves. You've transformed this company." She offered to sell me the rest of their shares at a significant discount, making me the sole owner of Meridian Financial. I accepted, using the profits from our improved performance to buy them out completely. Looking back, I realized that Gerald did me a favor in the cruelest way possible. His constant belittling forced me to prove, to myself and to everyone else, that I was capable of far more than answering phones and filing papers. Every time he called me just a secretary, he was actually challenging me to become something greater. The funny thing is, I never wanted to be a CEO. I just wanted to be respected for my intelligence and contributions. I wanted to work in an environment where my ideas mattered, where my efforts were valued. If Gerald had simply treated me with basic human dignity, I probably would have stayed in my support role for years, content to contribute in smaller ways. Instead, his cruelty pushed me to achieve something I never would have attempted otherwise. 2 years later, Meridian Financial Group has tripled in size. We've opened offices in 3 new cities. We've been recognized as one of the best places to work in Chicago's financial district. And yes, we hire a lot of secretaries and administrative assistants. But in my company, those roles are respected, valued, and seen as stepping stones to greater opportunities for those who want them. I often think about Gerald and wonder what happened to him. Through industry connections, I heard he eventually found another position at a smaller firm. I hope he learned something from our experience. I hope he treats his current staff better than he treated me. But honestly, his journey is no longer my concern. My focus is on building something positive from the destruction he tried to create. What I learned through this experience is that bullies like Gerald count on their victims staying victims. They depend on people accepting their limitations, believing the cruel narratives, giving up on their dreams. Gerald expected me to internalize his message that I was just a secretary who will never amount to anything. He expected me to be broken down by his constant criticism, to accept my place and stop reaching for more. But here's the truth that every Gerald in every workplace needs to understand. When you systematically underestimate someone, when you consistently undervalue their potential, you're not just being cruel, you're being stupid. You're motivating them to prove you wrong. If you're dealing with a Gerald in your own life, whether it's a boss, a family member, a partner, or anyone else who tries to define your limitations, remember this. Their opinion of you is not the truth about you. Their cruelty says everything about them and nothing about your potential. Use their negativity as fuel. Every time they tell you what you can't do, write down what you're going to prove you can do. Every time they dismiss your ideas, document those ideas and find ways to develop them on your own. Success isn't just about proving bullies wrong. It's about building something meaningful despite their attempts to tear you down. It's about creating the kind of environment you wished you'd had when you were struggling. Today, when I walk through the offices of Meridian Financial Group, I see confident employees sharing ideas, supporting each other's growth, and building something remarkable together. The scared, demoralized secretary who used to sit in the corner taking notes while being insulted, she's gone. In her place is someone who learned that power isn't about putting other people down. It's about lifting them up. Gerald spent 3 years trying to convince me I was worthless. Instead, he taught me exactly how valuable I really was. He spent 3 years telling me I'd never amount to anything. Instead, he motivated me to amount to everything he said I couldn't. So thank you, Gerald Hutchinson, wherever you are. Thank you for being exactly the kind of boss no one should ever have to work for. Thank you for pushing me to become exactly the kind of leader everyone deserves to work with. And to everyone watching this who has ever been told they're just anything, just a secretary, just an assistant, just a worker, just not good enough, remember this story. Remember that the people who try to limit you usually do so because they're threatened by your unlimited potential. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting ahead. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with respect in the workplace. And subscribe for more stories about turning life's challenges into victories. Because everyone has the potential to amount to something extraordinary, even if it takes a Gerald to help them realize it. My name is Rachel Martinez, and I used to be just a secretary. Now I'm the CEO of a company that believes iki.